What if I told you that the most influential figure in human history wasn't just a spiritual leader, but a master psychologist who used 3 specific mental strategies that made him impossible to defeat in any conversation or confrontation? For over 2,000 years, scholars have studied Jesus' teachings, but they've missed the hidden psychological framework that made him untouchable. Today, I'm going to reveal the 3 types of psychology Jesus used that you can apply immediately to become unshakable in any situation. These aren't just religious insights. They're psychological weapons that work whether you're leading a team, facing criticism, or dealing with impossible people. By the end of this video, you'll understand why nobody could trap Jesus in his words, and how you can use these same mental strategies today. If you're building influence or leading others, the most powerful psychological methods in history were hidden in plain sight for 2,000 years. These mental structures will change everything you know about persuasion and power. Here's something most people completely miss about Jesus. When his enemies tried to trap him with loaded questions, he rarely gave them the direct answers they expected. Instead, he used a psychological technique so sophisticated that modern negotiation experts are just beginning to understand its power. Think about this. Religious leaders, Roman officials, and hostile crowds spent 3 years trying to catch Jesus in his words, and they failed every single time. How is that possible? Most people think Jesus was just wise, but that misses the real strategy. When the Pharisees asked him about paying taxes to Caesar, trying to force him to either oppose Rome or abandon his followers, Jesus didn't fall into their trap. When they brought him a woman caught in adultery, demanding he choose between mercy and the law, he again refused to play their game. When Pontius Pilate interrogated him with the power of life and death, Jesus' responses left the governor more confused than when he started. This wasn't luck or divine intervention. This was psychological warfare at its finest. Jesus understood something that most people never grasp. The person who controls the frame of the conversation controls the outcome. But here's what's really fascinating. Jesus didn't just avoid traps. He turned every hostile question into an opportunity to gain more influence and authority. The religious leaders thought they were dealing with a simple preacher from Nazareth. The Romans thought they were handling another potential rebel. They had no idea they were going up against someone who understood human psychology better than anyone in history. Jesus used what modern psychologists call strategic reframing. But he didn't just reframe arguments. He reframed entire worldviews. Every time someone tried to corner him, Jesus would shift the conversation to a completely different level, leaving his opponents feeling like they were playing checkers while he was playing chess. But this wasn't manipulation for personal gain. It was precision psychology designed to expose truth and transform minds. The question is, how did a carpenter from a small-town master psychological techniques that Harvard Business School teaches today as advanced leadership strategies? The answer lies in what psychologists call strategic indirection, the ability to address questions by going deeper than the surface level. When Jesus faced hostile questions, he employed 3 specific psychological tactics that made him undefeatable. First, he used question reversal, answering questions with better questions that exposed his opponent's real motivations. When the Pharisees asked if it was lawful to pay taxes to Caesar, Jesus asked whose image was on the coin. This wasn't evasion, it was genius. He forced them to acknowledge that they were already participating in Caesar's system by carrying his currency, making their question hypocritical. The psychological principle here is profound. When you make someone examine their own assumptions, they can't maintain their attack position. Second, Jesus used cognitive bridging, connecting abstract concepts to concrete experiences that everyone could understand. When religious leaders questioned his authority to forgive sins, he didn't give them theological arguments. Instead, he healed a paralyzed man, creating undeniable evidence that bridged the gap between the invisible spiritual realm and visible physical reality. This technique works because the human brain processes concrete evidence faster than abstract arguments. Third, and this is where Jesus becomes absolutely untouchable, he used empathetic mirroring to expose people's hearts without attacking their defenses. When the woman at the well tried to deflect his spiritual insights by arguing about worship locations, Jesus acknowledged her deflection, but then gently revealed that he knew about her 5 husbands. He didn't shame her. He showed her that real connection transcends surface-level debates. Here's what made this so psychologically powerful. Jesus never made his opponents feel stupid or defeated. Instead, he created moments of self-recognition where they discovered their own contradictions. Modern psychology calls this insight learning. When people reach conclusions themselves, those conclusions become unshakable beliefs. But there's something even deeper happening here. Jesus understood that most human conflict comes from people defending positions they don't actually believe in. By using strategic indirection, he bypassed their defensive mechanisms and spoke directly to their authentic selves. This is why his opponents often walked away confused rather than angry. He had reached past their public personas to touch something real inside them. The religious leaders came expecting to embarrass a simple preacher. Instead, they found themselves face to face with their own spiritual poverty. The Romans came expecting to intimidate another potential troublemaker. Instead, they encountered someone whose authority transcended their political power. Jesus had mastered the ultimate psychological truth. Real influence comes not from winning arguments, but from transforming the people you're arguing with. Think of Jesus' strategic indirection like a master chess player facing multiple opponents. While his enemies were focused on capturing his pieces, he was already thinking 10 moves ahead, positioning himself for checkmate. But here's the brilliant part. He wasn't trying to defeat his opponents. He was trying to wake them up to a completely different game. Imagine you're in a heated argument with someone who's determined to prove you wrong. Most people either fight back or give up. Jesus discovered a third option. Elevate the conversation to a level where the original argument becomes irrelevant. It's like someone arguing about which route to take to the store, and Jesus responds by asking why they need to go to the store in the first place. Suddenly, the entire premise of the conflict shifts. The psychological power behind this approach is that it transforms adversaries into allies by addressing their deeper needs rather than their surface positions. When the rich young ruler asked what he needed to do to inherit eternal life, Jesus didn't give him a religious checklist. Instead, he identified the man's real problem. His attachment to wealth was preventing him from experiencing true freedom. The young man walked away sad, but he walked away with truth. This technique works because it bypasses the ego's need to be right and speaks directly to the soul's need to be authentic. When you use strategic indirection, you're not trying to win the argument. You're trying to win the person. You're showing them a version of themselves they haven't seen before. Here's how you can apply this immediately. The next time someone challenges you or tries to put you in a corner, don't defend your position. Instead, ask a question that makes them examine their own motivations. Don't attack their argument. Elevate the conversation to address the real issue underneath their words. This isn't manipulation, it's liberation. You're freeing both yourself and them from the prison of surface-level conflict. The most powerful part of Jesus' approach was that his opponents often left these encounters changed, even when they initially came to defeat him. That's the mark of true psychological mastery. Transforming your enemies into better versions of themselves. If this is exploding your mind, stop now and hit subscribe. Because what comes next will blow your understanding of influence, and if you don't subscribe, the algorithm will hide my next secrets from you. Here's the second psychological weapon in Jesus' arsenal that made him impossible to defeat. Emotional mirroring so advanced that people felt completely understood without ever being judged. But this wasn't simple empathy. This was strategic emotional intelligence that could disarm the most hostile opponents and transform the hardest hearts. Consider this. Jesus encountered tax collectors who were hated by everyone, prostitutes who were rejected by society, Roman soldiers who were feared as occupiers, and religious leaders who were respected but internally corrupt. Yet somehow he could connect with each of these completely different personalities in ways that left them feeling seen, understood, and valued. How is that psychologically possible? Most people think emotional intelligence means being nice or sympathetic. That's not what Jesus was doing. When he encountered the Samaritan woman at the well, he didn't offer her pity or try to fix her problems. Instead, he mirrored her emotional state while simultaneously elevating her sense of worth. When she deflected with sarcasm about his request for water, he matched her directness, but added layers of deeper meaning that intrigued rather than offended her. The fascinating thing is that Jesus could mirror emotions without becoming trapped by them. When people brought him their anger, he reflected their passion, but redirected it toward justice. When they brought him their grief, he absorbed their pain but transformed it into hope. When they brought him their fear, he acknowledged their vulnerability but replaced it with courage. This is what psychologists today call emotional Aikido, using the energy of someone's emotions to create positive transformation rather than trying to block or overcome those emotions. But Jesus took this to a level that modern psychology is just beginning to understand. Here's what made Jesus's emotional mirroring so psychologically powerful. He could see past people's defensive emotions to identify their authentic feelings underneath. When the rich young ruler claimed he had kept all the commandments, Jesus didn't challenge his statement directly. Instead, he looked at him with love and identified the man's real emotion, the fear that he wasn't enough. By addressing the fear rather than the pride, Jesus created a moment of genuine connection that no argument could have achieved. The religious leaders who opposed Jesus were masters of emotional manipulation themselves. They knew how to use fear, guilt, and shame to control people. But when they encountered Jesus, their techniques didn't work. He had mastered something far more powerful than emotional manipulation: emotional transformation. The secret behind Jesus' emotional mastery lies in what modern neuroscience calls emotional regulation, combined with empathetic accuracies. But Jesus was using these techniques 2,000 years before science could explain them. He had discovered that emotions are not just feelings, they're information systems that reveal what people truly need. When Jesus encountered the woman caught in adultery, surrounded by a mob ready to stone her, he demonstrated emotional mirroring at its most sophisticated level. The crowd's emotion was righteous anger mixed with hidden guilt. They were projecting their own moral failures onto this woman. Jesus didn't lecture them about hypocrisy. Instead, he mirrored their desire for justice while exposing their own need for mercy. His response, "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone," was psychologically brilliant because it acknowledged their righteous emotion while redirecting it inward. He essentially said, "I understand your desire for justice, but let's make sure it's consistent." This wasn't emotional manipulation, it was emotional clarification. But here's where Jesus' technique becomes truly masterful. He simultaneously mirrored the woman's shame and fear while replacing them with dignity and hope. When the accusers left and he told her, "Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more," he was giving her both acceptance and empowerment. He felt her emotions with her, but didn't let those emotions define her future. The psychological principle behind this is profound. When someone truly mirrors your emotions without judgment, it creates what psychologists call emotional safety. In this safe space, people can examine their own feelings honestly and choose different responses. Jesus created these moments of emotional safety even in hostile environments. Consider his interaction with Zacchaeus, the tax collector. Everyone else saw Zacchaeus as a traitor and thief. Jesus saw past the public persona to identify the man's real emotion, loneliness, and the desperate need for acceptance. By simply asking to stay at his house, Jesus mirrored Zacchaeus' need for connection while offering him the dignity of being chosen rather than rejected. This technique worked because Jesus understood that people's worst behaviors usually spring from their deepest wounds. Instead of addressing the behavior directly, he addressed the emotional wound underneath. When you heal the wound, the behavior changes naturally. The psychological power of this approach is that it transforms resistance into cooperation. When people feel truly understood, they stop defending themselves and start examining themselves. Jesus' opponents found it almost impossible to maintain their hostility because his emotional mirroring disarmed their defensive mechanisms. Modern psychology has confirmed that emotional mirroring creates neural synchronization between people. Their brain waves literally start matching. Jesus was creating these moments of deep connection that bypassed intellectual arguments and spoke directly to the heart. This is why his influence was so powerful and lasting. He wasn't just changing minds, he was changing the emotional foundations that drive human behavior. Think of Jesus's emotional mirroring like a skilled musician who can join any song that's playing and gradually guide it toward a more beautiful melody. He didn't try to stop the music or force a different tune. He harmonized with what was already there and then led it somewhere better. Imagine you're dealing with an angry customer, frustrated colleague, or rebellious teenager. Most people either match their anger with more anger or try to shut down their emotions with logic. Jesus discovered a third way. Acknowledge their emotion as valid, mirror their passion, but redirect that energy toward a solution instead of destruction. Here's the practical psychology. When someone feels heard and understood, their brain literally shifts from defensive mode to collaborative mode. Jesus mastered this by paying attention to what people were feeling underneath what they were saying. The Pharisees weren't really angry about his teachings, they were afraid of losing their authority. The tax collectors weren't really greedy, they were trying to gain the acceptance they'd never received. This emotional insight gave Jesus incredible power in every interaction. While others were fighting surface-level battles, he was addressing the root emotional needs that drove people's behavior. It's like being a doctor who treats the disease instead of just managing symptoms. You can use this technique immediately. When someone is upset with you, resist the urge to defend yourself or dismiss their feelings. Instead, say something like, "I can see this really matters to you," or "Help me understand what you're experiencing." This simple acknowledgement often dissolves 80% of the conflict, because people mostly just want to feel heard and understood. The genius of Jesus's approach was that he made people feel emotionally safe enough to examine their own hearts honestly. When you're not being judged or attacked, you can look at yourself more clearly. This is why his conversations often ended with people changing their entire life direction. Not because he forced them to change, but because he created space for them to see themselves as they really were and choose who they wanted to become. Jesus understood that lasting transformation happens at the emotional level, not just the intellectual level. You can't think your way into better behavior, but you can feel your way there when someone creates the right emotional environment for growth and healing. If you're watching this far, you are different from most people. Prove it. Hit like now and subscribe, because people like you deserve to know all the secrets I'll reveal in upcoming videos. Now, we come to Jesus's most powerful psychological weapon, the one that made him absolutely untouchable and explains why his influence has lasted for 2,000 years. Jesus had mastered what modern psychology calls cognitive reframing, the ability to completely shift how people perceive reality. But this wasn't just changing perspectives, this was restructuring entire worldviews in real time. Here's what made this so psychologically devastating to his opponents. Jesus could take any situation, no matter how carefully orchestrated to trap him, and reframe it in ways that revealed deeper truths nobody had considered. When his enemies thought they had him cornered, he would shift the entire conversation to a dimension they hadn't even imagined existed. Consider the most famous example. When they brought Jesus the woman caught in adultery, this wasn't just about one woman's sin. The religious leaders had carefully crafted this as the perfect trap. If Jesus showed mercy, they could accuse him of disregarding God's law. If he condemned her, they could accuse him of lacking compassion. They thought they had created an impossible situation. But Jesus didn't just escape their trap, he completely reframed the entire scenario. Instead of making it about the woman's sin or their law, he made it about everyone's need for mercy. Instead of focusing on past behavior, he redirected toward future possibility. Instead of judgment versus compassion, he created a new category: transformative grace. The psychological power of this reframe was devastating. Suddenly, the accusers found themselves in the position of being judged rather than being judges. The woman found herself receiving dignity instead of condemnation, and everyone present discovered that the real question wasn't, "What should we do with sinners?" but "How should imperfect people treat each other?" This technique worked because Jesus understood something profound about human psychology. People get trapped in false dichotomies, either or, thinking that limits their options and creates unnecessary conflict. By introducing a third way, he consistently transcended the limitations his opponents tried to impose. When the Pharisees asked whether it was lawful to heal on the Sabbath, trying to force him to choose between compassion and religious law, Jesus reframed the entire question. Is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save life or to kill? Suddenly, the conversation wasn't about rules versus mercy. It was about the purpose behind the rules. The genius of Jesus' reframing was that it didn't destroy his opponents' positions, it transcended them. He showed that their questions were based on incomplete understanding of the bigger picture. This is why his answers often left people speechless rather than angry. He hadn't defeated their arguments, he had revealed that they were arguing about the wrong things entirely. The secret behind Jesus' reframing mastery lies in what cognitive psychologists call hierarchical thinking, the ability to see multiple levels of meaning simultaneously and address the highest level to resolve conflicts at lower levels. Jesus had developed this to such a degree that he could reframe any situation from the temporal to the eternal, from the personal to the universal, from the material to the spiritual. When Pontius Pilate interrogated Jesus, trying to intimidate him with Roman power, Jesus reframed the entire concept of authority. You would have no authority over me unless it had been given to you from above. With one sentence, he shifted the conversation from political power to cosmic order, making Pilate's threats irrelevant while revealing the temporary nature of all earthly authority. This wasn't just clever wordplay, this was psychological mastery that operated on multiple levels simultaneously. Jesus understood that human problems usually exist at surface levels, but solutions often require perspective from higher levels. When people were fighting over who was the greatest among his disciples, he didn't try to settle the argument. Instead, he reframed greatness itself. Whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all. The psychological principle here is transformative. When you change the definition of success, you eliminate the competition that created the conflict. Jesus consistently reframed competitive situations into collaborative opportunities by expanding the criteria for what really mattered. But here's where Jesus' reframing becomes truly masterful. He could maintain multiple perspectives simultaneously without losing coherence. When the rich young ruler asked about eternal life, Jesus could simultaneously see the man's sincere seeking, his hidden attachments, his future potential, and his present limitations. His response, "Sell everything and follow me," addressed all these levels at once. This technique was psychologically devastating to his opponents because they couldn't predict or prepare for his responses. Traditional Jewish teachers would quote other rabbis or cite precedents. Jesus would reframe the entire context that made their questions relevant. It's like preparing for a chess match and discovering your opponent has moved the game to 3 dimensions. The ultimate example of Jesus' reframing power came during his trial and crucifixion. His enemies thought they were demonstrating his powerlessness by executing him. Jesus reframed the crucifixion as the ultimate demonstration of love and the pathway to victory over death itself. He transformed what appeared to be the ultimate defeat into the ultimate triumph by reframing the entire meaning of power, victory, and success. Modern neuroscience has discovered that reframing literally rewires the brain, creating new neural pathways that change how people process future experiences. Jesus was performing cognitive surgery on people's worldviews, not just offering new information, but creating entirely new ways of thinking about reality. This is why his influence has been so enduring. He didn't just teach people what to think, he taught them how to think differently. He gave them cognitive frameworks that could transform any situation, no matter how difficult or hopeless it appeared. Think of Jesus' reframing ability like a master architect who can look at any structure and immediately see how to redesign it from the foundation up to serve a completely different purpose. While others saw problems, he saw opportunities for transformation. Imagine you're stuck in traffic, frustrated and angry. Most people stay trapped in that emotional state. But what if someone could help you reframe that traffic jam as unexpected free time for reflection, or as a reminder to appreciate the journey instead of obsessing over the destination? Suddenly, the same situation becomes entirely different. Not because the circumstances changed, but because your framework for interpreting those circumstances transformed. Jesus mastered this psychological technique and applied it to the deepest human struggles. When people saw death, he showed them transformation. When they saw failure, he revealed learning opportunities. When they saw enemies, he demonstrated the possibility of redemption. He wasn't denying reality. He was revealing hidden dimensions of reality that people had missed. The practical power of this approach is extraordinary. When you learn to reframe situations, you become emotionally and psychologically unshakable. Instead of being victimized by circumstances, you become empowered to find meaning and opportunity in any situation. This is why Jesus could remain calm during his trial, peaceful during his crucifixion, and loving toward his enemies. He was operating from a framework that transcended their ability to harm him. You can apply this immediately. The next time you face a frustrating situation, ask yourself, how else could I interpret this? What might this experience be teaching me? How could this difficulty become a strength? These reframing questions literally change your brain's response to stress and conflict. The ultimate reframe that Jesus offered was this: life isn't about avoiding suffering. It's about transforming suffering into wisdom, love, and service to others. Death isn't the end of existence. It's the transition to a different kind of life. Human weakness isn't shameful. It's the doorway to discovering divine strength. This cognitive framework made Jesus psychologically invincible because no external circumstance could threaten his core identity or mission. His opponents could attack his body, question his authority, or challenge his teachings, but they couldn't touch the foundational reframe that gave meaning to everything he experienced. Now you understand the three psychological weapons that made Jesus impossible to defeat. Strategic indirection that bypassed defensive mechanisms, emotional mirroring that created transformative safety, and cognitive reframing that transcended limiting perspectives. Together, these techniques didn't just help him win arguments, they transformed everyone he encountered by addressing their deepest needs for truth, understanding, and meaning. The most powerful insight is that Jesus used these psychological tools not to manipulate or control, but to liberate people from the mental prisons that limited their potential. When you master strategic indirection, emotional mirroring, and cognitive reframing, you don't just become unshakable in conflict. You become a catalyst for positive transformation in everyone around you. The question isn't whether these techniques work. 2,000 years of influence proves they do. The question is, are you ready to apply them? If these secrets exploded your mind, you need to see my next videos, but only if you hit the bell. Otherwise, you'll miss the most powerful secrets in history. What's your opinion about these psychological insights? Leave it in the comments. Send this revelation to that friend who has sharp perception. This analysis is speculative and based on historical accounts and psychological interpretation of publicly available information, not clinical diagnosis. The psychological techniques discussed are presented for educational purposes and should be applied ethically and responsibly.